Imagine buying a cactus because you desperately want a low-maintenance pet.
Oh yeah, the classic easy plant.
Right. But then you discover that this specific cactus requires like a highly calibrated temperature-controlled environment and a meticulous weekly haircut just to survive.
Sounds awful.
It is. You bought it so you wouldn't have to think about it. And now it is literally the only thing you think about.
Yeah, that completely backfires.
So today we are opening up a really personal, honestly kind of messy diary entry from May 14th, 2026 to explore that exact kind of trap. We're unpacking a gardening journal written by a gardener named Ang, and the title of this entry is Notes on Gardening, Part 894, To Seed or to Snip My Mealycup Sage.
What's fascinating here is that just the number, right? Part 894, that alone tells you so much. We are not getting a polished theoretical textbook introduction.
Oh, not at all.
We are dropping right into the messy middle of a massive ongoing trial and error process.
Right, and I know you might be listening to this wondering, why are we dedicating an entire deep dive to one person's quick field notes? Notes about a plant they probably just picked up on a weekend hardware store run.
It sounds super niche.
It does. But the mission today is not actually about gardening. We are going to extract some pretty profound lessons from Ang's notes about expectation versus reality. We'll get into the intense biological mechanisms of adaptability.
Which is wild, by the way.
Yeah, totally wild. And also just the tiny, everyday micro decisions involved when you try to introduce a new system into your life.
Yeah, and by jumping into this specific moment in Eng's journal, we're looking at the exact point where a theoretical philosophy crashes into biological reality.
The brick wall of reality.
Exactly. By examining one person's highly specific struggle with a single plant, the Mealycup Sage, scientifically, Salvia farinacea, we can learn an immense amount about how systems actually operate, how environments dictate our success, and honestly, how we routinely misunderstand our own habits.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Ang's entry immediately gives us the setup for an experiment that is, it's absolutely riddled with contradictions from the start.
Oh, completely.
Ang mentions previously buying 2 of these Mealycup Sage specimens. This was documented way back in Part 811, specifically to test them out. Ang wanted to see how this plant would adapt to 2 things. First, their personal hands-off gardening style.
Right.
And second, the different microclimates within their garden spaces.
And the hands-off approach is the holy grail for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Ang defines this as mostly leaving the plants to grow entirely on their own, with only, occasional watering.
Just letting nature do its thing?
Yeah, it's a philosophy of minimal intervention. You set the system up and you just let it run.
But this is where my brain gets stuck.
Yeah.
Because if you know you have a hands-off style, why purposely test a plant in different microclimates?
That's a good question.
Right. By definition, testing different microclimates, moving a pot to see how it handles morning sun versus afternoon shade, or checking wind exposure and soil moisture, doesn't that inherently require active observation?
It absolutely does. You have to monitor it.
My hypothesis here is that Ang is trying to run a proactive, highly engaged experiment on how to be completely lazy. It just feels like a total oxymoron.
That tension is exactly why this journal entry is so revealing. You are hitting on the fundamental friction between a desired lifestyle and the strict reality of the scientific method.
Yeah.
Ang wants to be a passive manager. They want the aesthetic reward of a beautiful garden without the daily operational grind of, actually maintaining it.
Right, they want the flowers without the sweat.
Exactly. But finding a plant's ideal microclimate requires an intense, really hands-on period of data gathering.
You can't just throw a plant in the yard, walk away for a month, and call it a microclimate study.
Not if you want actionable data. And that tension, it doesn't just exist in a garden. You see the exact same friction when a company tries to roll out, automated software, or when a person tries to build a new daily habit.
Oh, like setting up a smart home system that takes a whole weekend to configure.
Exactly. We tell ourselves we want a system that runs itself. But the setup phase of any passive system is aggressively active.
Aggressively active, yeah.
Ang is discovering that you cannot effectively test a hands-off hypothesis without initially getting your hands very dirty. Understanding your own maintenance style is just crucial when introducing anything new into your environment.
There's a gap there.
A massive gap. There is almost always a massive gap between how much attention you want to give and how much attention a new element demands just to integrate successfully.
And unfortunately for Ang, the microclimate experiment hits a massive biological roadblock. The plants are just not thriving under this hands-off approach.
Not at all.
Which pushes us to look at the actual traits of the Mealycup sage itself. Because, if you just read the label on the pot, this plant sounds like the absolute perfect match for a lazy gardener.
Oh, it reads like a dream resume for someone who wants to do the bare minimum.
Right. The journal notes that the Mealycup sage loves full sun. It is highly drought tolerant, and it doesn't require heavy fertilizing.
Sounds perfect.
If I'm Ang, I'm looking at those specs and thinking, I've hit the jackpot. I can put this thing in the blazing sun, forget to water it for weeks, never feed it, and it'll be completely fine.
But the reality Ang documents is a complete clash of needs.
The huge clash.
Mm-hmm.
The catch is that you have to prune the plant frequently to keep it tidy and to encourage more blooms. So on one hand, it can survive a brutal drought and terrible soil. But on the other hand, it throws an absolute fit if you don't give it a haircut.
It seems wildly contradictory.
Right. If it is biologically wired to survive a drought, shouldn't it be strong enough to push out flowers on its own? Like, is it just hoarding its energy because it senses a lack of resources?
Well, you are spot on about it hoarding energy, but you're kind of confusing the biological mechanism of survival with the biological mechanism of flourishing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, this raises an important question about how we define success. Ang realizes right here in the journal that their initial hopes were, quote, a bit optimistic. Let's look at the science of drought tolerance.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the plant thrives without water. It means the plant possesses defensive mechanisms to avoid dying.
Ah, so it's just playing defense.
Exactly. When water is scarce, a plant closes its stomata. Those are the microscopic pores on its leaves. It closes them to prevent water vapor from escaping.
So it essentially holds its breath.
It holds its breath, yes.
Yeah.
But because those pores are closed, it also cannot take in carbon dioxide.
And without that, no photosynthesis.
Right. Photosynthesis plummets. The plant goes into a severe low-power mode. It shuts down all non-essential functions like, producing vibrant, beautiful flowers just to keep its core cellular systems alive.
Okay, that makes sense for the drought part. But how does pruning fit into that? Why does snipping the plant force it to make flowers?
So that comes down to plant hormones, specifically one called auxin.
Auxin, yeah.
The dominant topmost stem of a plant produces auxins that travel downward, and these hormones chemically suppress the growth of lower branches. It's called apical dominance.
So the top stem is basically telling the rest of the plant to stay dormant.
Yes. The plant wants to grow tall to compete for sunlight, so it suppresses its own lateral growth. When Ang or any gardener really comes in with scissors and snips off that top growth, they are physically removing the chemical suppressor.
Wow.
Yeah. The hormone levels drop, the dormant buds lower down on the stem wake up, and the plant is forced to bush out and create new flowers.
That is wild. So pruning is basically like a corporate budget reallocation.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like if the plant is a CEO during a financial drought, it freezes all research and development funding the blooms just to keep the lights on and survive.
Right, essential operations only?
Exactly. So pruning is like an activist board member stepping in, cutting off a stagnant division, and forcing the CEO to redistribute those funds into new, vibrant projects.
That is a perfect analogy. The plant will not reallocate that energy on its own. It absolutely requires the physical intervention of the gardener. Ang didn't just want a surviving green stick in the yard, they wanted blooms.
Yeah, you don't plant a garden just for green sticks.
Exactly. And for you listening to this, think about how often we make this exact same mistake in our professional or personal lives. We see a colleague or a team member who is a high performer, someone who is tough and quote-unquote drought tolerant in the face of a heavy workload. We just assume their resilience means they require zero attention.
Oh, man. We just leave them alone and expect them to keep producing brilliant work.
And they will survive. They will get the baseline job done. But if you want them to flourish, if you want new ideas, creativity, and those proverbial blooms, you actually have to engage with them. You have to step in and help clear away the clutter or essentially prune their obstacles.
Wow, that's incredibly relatable.
Right. Ang fell into the trap of thinking ruggedness equaled perpetual beauty with no effort. The biology of the Mealycup sage is telling Ang, look, I can survive without you, but I cannot flourish without you.
I can survive without you, but I cannot flourish without you. That is incredible. So Ang has come to this stark realization that the hands-off approach is a total failure if the goal is getting continuous blooms. The pruning paradox kind of ruined the whole passive experiment.
It did. It completely blew up the hypothesis.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because Ang's reaction to this failure isn't to suddenly become like a hyperactive gardener and start aggressively pruning. Instead, Ang pivots to a completely different biological outcome, waiting to harvest seeds.
A total shift in strategy.
Yeah. And to do that, Ang decides to leave the plants entirely alone.
Right. A total cessation of intervention. They're abandoning the flowers to focus on the future lineage of the plant.
The ultimate irony is that Ang finally gets to use their beloved hands-off approach. But it is entirely out of necessity now, not convenience.
It's a forced hands-off.
Exactly. Ang has to wait for those vibrant purple flower spikes to physically transform into dry, brown spikes before the seeds are mature enough to harvest. It is the gardening equivalent of active inaction. You're doing nothing, but you have to do nothing with extreme focus, like leaving a cake in the oven. You aren't doing anything actively, but the waiting is the most stressful part because of the exact timing required.
Active inaction is a brilliant way to frame it. And what is most revealing about this stage of Ang's journal is the sensory shift that is documented.
What do you mean by sensory shift?
Well, Ang is no longer looking at the plant for its aesthetic value. They are monitoring a highly specific biological decay. They are watching vibrant purple turn to dry brown.
Oh, I see.
That visual shift is the definitive marker of the plant moving from its reproductive phase, where it uses showy colors to attract pollinators, to its legacy phase, the actual creation and hardening of the seeds.
It changes the entire relationship between the gardener and the garden. You stop looking for what is pretty and start looking for what is functional.
Precisely. By being forced to wait for this very specific color change, Ang is forced to carefully observe the plant's visual cues rather than just letting it exist invisibly in the background.
You actually have to pay attention.
Yeah, and think about the implication of that for you, the listener. Sometimes a process fails, not because we executed it poorly, but because we were paying attention to the completely wrong signals.
We're looking at the purple when we should be looking for the brown.
Exactly. Ang wanted the purple blooms, but to salvage this experiment, Ang has to learn to deeply value the ugly, dry, brown spikes. It is a complete mental pivot. Ang is learning that true hands-off management still requires intense, focused observation of the right metrics.
But of course, even with this newfound patience, even with Ang carefully tracking the transition from purple to brown, the environment refuses to cooperate.
Naturally, because a garden doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right. Ang notes in the journal that the seeds of the Mealycup Sage are tiny, and unfortunately, they are currently facing a heavy rainy season. The journal points out that this combination delicate, microscopic seeds and persistent rain is making it incredibly difficult to harvest whatever is left on the plant.
It's a worst-case scenario for seed harvesting.
I read this and felt genuine exasperation for Ang. You know, you put in all this time, you realize your first theory was wrong, you adjust your expectations, you endure the agonizing wait for the seeds to mature, and then nature just steps in and washes your hard work away.
It's brutal.
If the rainy season is washing away the tiny seeds, isn't nature essentially doing the hands-off gardening for them, just with disastrous results?
Oh, definitely. The environment is actively eroding the final output of the experiment. It is a classic confrontation between micro-intentions and macro-reality.
Yeah, Ang can control the microclimate of where the pot sits on the patio, but Ang cannot control a regional weather pattern.
You can't outmanage the rain.
It is infuriating. But Ang doesn't use the journal to complain about the weather. There is no emotional breakdown about the rain ruining everything. The entry immediately details a backup plan.
Which is so impressive.
It really is. Ang writes, if seed harvesting fails, I'll move on to propagation by cuttings, something to explore in the next few days. My first thought was, isn't a cutting just snapping off a leaf and sticking it in a glass of water? How does that bypass the seed entirely, like a backup generator?
Yeah, it is exactly like a backup generator. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this pivot to cuttings is the most profound biological lesson in the entire journal entry.
Really? More than the pruning?
I think so. Let's look at the science of what Ang is actually proposing here. Seeds are a high-stakes biological casino.
A casino. I like that.
The plant creates thousands of them because they are so vulnerable. They blow away, they wash away in the rain, they get eaten. They rely on absolutely perfect soil conditions to sprout. It is a high-risk, high-reward evolutionary strategy that relies heavily on a cooperative environment.
Which the rainy season is aggressively refusing to provide.
Exactly. But propagation by cuttings relies on an evolutionary marvel called totipotency.
Cotipotency. Okay, what is that?
Totipotency is the ability of a single mature plant cell to completely reprogram itself.
Wait, reprogram itself.
Yes, when Eng snips off a piece of the living plant stem, those stem cells realize they are severed from their root system. Under the right conditions, those adult stem cells will revert to an embryonic state and literally transform into root cells to save themselves.
That is science fiction level biology happening on a patio.
It really is.
The cells just decide to become a completely different organ to survive.
They reprogram their entire identity. By moving to cuttings, Eng is taking the control back from the rainy season. It bypasses the vulnerable seed stage entirely. It is a controlled surgical intervention.
Wow.
Instead of giving up when the fragile primary strategy is threatened by uncontrollable external weather, Eng maps out a method to force cellular reprogramming.
It is such a pragmatic, structurally brilliant response to failure. Just seeds are washing away. Next step, force stem cells to become root cells.
And for the listener, this is the ultimate lesson in adaptability. When external conditions ruin your primary strategy, do you fold or do you find the structural equivalent of a cutting? Do you find a way to bypass the environmental threat and force growth in a new, highly controlled way?
That's such a good question to ask yourself.
But notice the irony here too. Aang realizes that the hands-off dream is entirely dead. To successfully propagate a cutting, you have to sterilize your scissors, make a precise cut below a leaf node, strip the bottom leaves, and manage the soil moisture perfectly so the severed stem doesn't rot before it roots.
Oh, wow. So you have to be incredibly careful.
It is the most hands-on, intensive, deeply involved process possible.
It really is a complete 180-degree turn. Aang's journey has gone from hoping to do absolutely nothing to preparing to perform delicate plant surgery just to keep the lineage alive.
Yeah, the plant demanded engagement.
And it all happens in this one brief snapshot of a journal entry. So what does this all mean? Let's trace the arc of what we've unpacked today from Aang's notes. We started with a seemingly simple microclimate experiment using 2 Mealycup Sage plants, driven by a desire for a lazy, hands-off lifestyle.
Which fell apart quickly.
Right. We then uncovered the pruning paradox, the biological reality that a drought-tolerant plant will slip into a low-power survival mode and demands chemical manipulation through pruning if you actually want it to flourish.
Survival versus flourishing.
Then we felt the tension of active inaction, waiting for vibrant purple to fade into dry brown to harvest seeds. And finally, we saw the chaotic curveball of the rainy season, which forced a brilliant pivot toward the intense cellular-level intervention of propagation by cuttings.
It is a remarkable documentation of expectation meeting reality. And I think the core message here for you, listening to this deep dive, is to rigorously evaluate your own hands-off approaches. Whether you are managing a backyard garden, overseeing a complex software integration, or leading a team of people, the reality is that the hands-off approach is rarely as simple as it sounds on paper.
It never is.
True resilience in a system doesn't mean you can ignore it. It means the system has the biological or structural capacity to survive while you figure out the precise kind of attention it actually needs to thrive. Adaptability isn't just about changing your mind when things get hard. It is about completely changing your mechanisms, from the high-stakes gamble of seeds to the surgical control of cuttings, when the environment demands it.
That is such a powerful takeaway. We go into these endeavors thinking we are the ones in charge, setting the rules, dictating the microclimates, and running the experiment. But the material pushes back.
It always pushes back.
The biology has its own rules. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over today. Think about Aang's journey through this single journal entry. If a plant forces you to completely abandon your core hands-off philosophy,
Right.
if it makes you constantly monitor its vibrant purple spikes for subtle color decay,
Yeah.
if it makes you stress over the fate of tiny seeds in a rainstorm, and if it ultimately drives you to research cellular totipotency and surgical cuttings just to keep your original experiment going,
That's a lot of work.
who is really cultivating whom? Are you shaping the garden, or is the garden shaping you?